thanks for the invitation. People can, is this mentioned? Okay. So there's a couple handouts going around. There are two excerpts, so don't do one of those things of like, all right, I got one of these things, because there's actually two of them going around, which I've creatively titled excerpt number 1 and excerpt number 2. And I don't know if there's enough actually. I made 40 of each, so I'm going to be playing some music, just a little bit. And it would be good for people to have the lyrics. So I'll just say, before getting started, I'm going to be talking about, well, a lot of different things, but I'm going to start by talking about constellations, and in the sense that you look up to the stars and you say, hey, there's a constellation. And I should just mention as an aside, given the discussion today, I hadn't really thought about it so much, but it seems to me that it possibly, I don't know, just the possibility I'm considering and maybe a connection, is to think of data in terms of stars. I know, such that all of the discussions we had about how does one filter and select data, do you need to have something pre-formatted, an idea? I mean, one could think about that as a constellation of big data, in this sense, the stars being the data. That's not a thought-through thesis, but it's just a thought. I read you what I have thought through. So, as a kind of preface, I'd like to begin by playing an excerpt of the album from which part of my title is taken. Mos Def and Talib Kweli, Our Black Star. That's excerpt number 1. For now, I'm simply going to play this excerpt without comment, but further on in my talk, I'll refer to some key lines. Come back to that question. A constellation is a figure that's formed, or that's made to appear, through the imagination of lines that connect some stars with other stars. Constellations are imagined networks of stars. This is to say that the appearance of a constellation is bound to the imagination. The constellation that one sees is the constellation that one makes through imagining the lines between stars. Furthermore, this appearance of a constellation can be understood as media or mediation. The reason for this is that when one imagines a constellation, one mediates lines between stars. One mediates stars into relation with each other. One makes media of constellations by imagining networks of stars. This imagined media of constellation involves selection. To imagine a constellation is to select certain star relations and to exclude others. Accordingly, one can think about the imagination and mediation of constellations in terms of inclusion versus exclusion. Yet, more important than this inclusion-exclusion dynamic is the fact that a multitude of constellations may be imagined.
there are always more constellations to be imagined without any apparent limit. And the inclusion and exclusion dynamic already registers this point. To say that a constellation is excluded is to imagine an excluded constellation. In other words, more important than the exclusion of a constellation is the fact that, while excluded, this constellation is really imagined. One can therefore respond to this exclusion by way of the capacity of imagination. One can give attention to this excluded constellation. One can use imagination to mediate what's excluded. It seems then that the solution to any exclusion is always provided by imagination. We can always imagine additional constellations, and the number of such imaginable constellations would seem to be without limit, or appear to be without limit. Here we encounter the power of the imagination, or the power of media, that is, the power of the imaginative media of constellating. Given the immense number of stars and the immense number of ways these stars may be imagined or mediated, constellation names a potentiality that's unlimited, a potentiality able to exceed every limit, able to make appear a number that's multiplicitous or multitudinal beyond every count. Now, when I speak of constellations in terms of imagined media or in terms of mediated images, I'm not speaking metaphorically. Constellations are media. Consider, for instance, how contemporary sociality is marked by a saturation of media, by an awareness of media's capacity for excessive connection. This contemporary awareness of media's capacity to expand and expand in ever transformative ways is an awareness of the capacity of constellation. It's an awareness of constellation's capacity to imagine an unlimited network between stars. In fact, there's a striking link between the logic of sociality and the logic of stars in the sky. Here we should call Kant's famous remark about the, quote, two things that fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. One of these was the moral law within me. What was the other? The starry heavens above me. What does it mean that these two things, the moral law and the stars in the sky, what does it mean that these two things are brought together? For Kant, sociality must be submitted to the logic of this moral law within. Even if this submission is merely in principle, even if this submission is a matter of gradual progress, it remains the case that sociality is meant to be governed by the moral law within, of which Kant speaks. What's at stake then when Kant links the logic governing sociality to an image of stars in the sky? What's at stake? I'd like to take the implications of this image quite literally. Starry heavens are an image of enlightenment. When Kant links the law governing sociality to the starry heavens, he's imagining sociality in terms of enlightenment. In other words, he's imagining sociality as the task of achieving the clarity that light has when light stands out against the black sky. What is enlightenment? We can have debates, but at the very least it's this: the task of dividing the light from the darkness, the task of light escaping darkness. I want to insist on the importance of this division. To do so, however, is to make a shift from the multiplicity of constellation, about which I've been discussing so far, to the divisiveness of enlightenment. In other words, up till this point, I've addressed the multiplicitous potentiality of constellations. We can think of this in terms of discourses of multiple futures, alternative modernities, not one world but many worlds, etc., etc., etc. Yet, given the division of enlightenment, this multiplicitous potentiality of constellation becomes relative. This is to say that the excessive potentiality of constellation, of the imaginative media of social connectivity, appears only after the division of enlightenment has been made. The multiplicitous potentiality of constellation is based on enlightenment. Every constellation, after all, begins by being light, by gaining clarity through division from darkness, by having already escaped blackness. The logic of enlightenment, even when it's applied gradually or moderately, remains constitutively divisive. This division of enlightenment is strict and irreversible. The process moves only in one direction, from darkness to light. There may be various styles and various degrees of enlightenment, various constellations of enlightenment. Nonetheless, the directional imperative is clearly, invariantly apparent. Stop being dark, begin finding light. To consider this divisiveness of enlightenment is to reframe, then, the potentiality of constellations. All of this potentiality is based on not being black. Constellations appear only by appearing against a black background. However mediation is constellated, it appears as the network of light. Media appear as the light between the stars, and so media are based on stars, and stars are based on their capacity to stand out, to be divided from blackness. While constellations may be unlimited in their multiplicity of differentiation, this multiplicitous difference is based on a prior commonality of light. Light is the commonality underwriting all the multiplicity, differentiated and excessive, of constellations. This is because all stars and all constellations of stars appear by gaining distance from blackness. Blackness, on the other hand, taking these terms, blackness, on the other hand, is defined as unenlightened. It has no potential of constellation, no potential of unlimited differentiation, and no commonality with any constellation. The imaginative mediation of constellation, with all its multiplicity, is thus based on division or based on anti-blackness. What is anti-blackness? Is it racism? On one hand, yes, without doubt. When we talk about anti-blackness, we're talking about anti-black racism. Just as constellation has a potential that's based on its division from blackness, so whiteness constitutes itself as having a freedom that's based on its division from blackness. Allow me in this regard to quote Christina Sharp. The legal captivity of Africans and their descendants was central to the codification of rights and freedoms for those legally constituted as white and their legally white descendants. That is, freedoms for those people constituted as white were and are produced through an other's body legally and otherwise being made to wear unfreedom and to serve as a placeholder for access to freedoms that are denied the black subject. Now, this is clearly a case of anti-blackness as racism. Yet this anti-black racism is inseparable from constellation, where potentiality is imagined and mediated as enlightenment. It's in this sense that anti-blackness is not reducible to an empirical racism. On the contrary, anti-blackness is embedded in imagination. So I'm saying, on one hand, anti-blackness is about racism. On the other hand, it's not. It's just about the imagination, but shit, that makes it worse. You can think of it in terms of the anti-blackness as a kind of virus, the virality of anti-blackness in the sense that it's brought about through the imagination. So this embedding in the imagination is so severe that it registers, quote-unquote, naturally in our language. Black holes, dark matter, black marks, a black heart, a black soul, the blackening of being dirty, black death. So what's at stake ultimately is the heliotropism, the turning towards the light of imaginative media. As an indication of this, let me return to some lines from what I played before beginning this paper. These lines imagine a black star, that is, the black simultaneity of star and sky. Such an image of blackness undivided from blackness, of blackness refusing the division between black background and light's standing out. This is an unthought image, or an image of the unthought, and I quote from what I played. Against the canvas of the night appears a curious celestial phenomenon called black star. But what is it? Black star is an image, but it's also simultaneously, as we see, a question. It must be a question, and the reason it must be a question is because it imagines something that's not based on the media of enlightenment, the media of heliotropic division, the media of anti-blackness. Within the imaginary of enlightenment media, black stars are nothing. Black stars are unimaginable. Black stars are nothing because they're unimaginable, because they're not based on the media of divisive enlightenment. To not be based on divisive enlightenment is to be nothing, to be incapable of being distinct, incapable of standing out from the darkness, incapable of having a basis for mediating appearance. Along these lines, to ask what is a black star is to ask what is media without basis. This is because media as constellation is based on anti-blackness, the division of light from blackness. Similarly, we could say to ask what is a black constellation is to ask what is baseless media. So thus to speak of baseless media is to speak of media that refuse this basis, media that are baseless by refusing enlightenment and remaining black. The image of a black star is the image of baseless media. Now, it's with this question of baselessness, I think, that I would like to encounter the notion of contingency. This is because one valence of the term contingency is dependence. To say that something's contingent is to say that it depends on something else. A is contingent whenever A depends on the condition B. Thus contingency as dependence is always the introduction of a base. If A is contingent on B, then A has its basis is based on B. And this sort of introduction of a base is at issue whenever an explanation is offered. Any explanation of A imagines A as something based on an explanation. Thus there's a division even between A and explanation of A. Hang with me, I'll push this a little further. This is to say that, furthermore, within any explanation of A, if you want to explain A, if you want to say, hey, A, why? What I'm saying is you have contingency the minute you try to explain that. Well, A, because of, A is based on. But what happens when you do try and answer this question, yeah? Within any explanation of A, there's a division between A, which gets an explanation, and other possibilities which have no explanation. Consider, for instance, this question. Why is A the case? You could say X as well, but I read it sounds really like why is X Y? Why is A the case? To explain why A is the case, one will imagine some alternative possibility, which we'll call C. The explanation then consists of showing why C cannot be the case, and why A must instead be the case. In other words, you say, why A? They say, well, think about C. And you go, okay. Well, think about C, that could never be. No pun intended. You can never have C, therefore it must be A. Okay, so contingency here functions to divide and give alternative possibilities. So for the question, why A, we're given the following answer. Because C, the alternative to A, cannot be the base. Consequently, there's not only a division between A and explanation of A, there's also a division within the explanation between A as one contingent possibility and C as the other contingent possibility. All this is to say that contingency does not evade images based in division, it actually mediates them. Contingency is the mediation of A as something based on B, or contingency is the mediation of the division between A and C, A explanation of A, and so on. So, I would say that one ought to be suspicious of any alliance between contingency and baseless media. But you could just put it this other way. If contingency is to have anything to do with baselessness, it must be radicalized. That is, contingency must be thought precisely as the radical refusal of basis, of division, of explanation. In this sense, contingency would be radicalized only insofar as it's thought according to baselessness. What matters is not contingency so much as baselessness. More precisely, what matters are baseless media. What are baseless media? I'm going to be tautologous here, but just to flesh out the idea. Baseless media are media that have nothing on which to base themselves. It's a very intelligent point, but it's worth making. Baseless media do not possess a basis or a medium as something exterior. Baseless media are mediated as nothing. And they're mediated in terms of Enlightenment's division as blackness. And a black star in its unimaginability is nothing, in this sense, within this imagination. It's nothing. Nothing but an experimentum. New term. Experimentum. Which, when addressed in its Latin etymology, shifts between, at least in English, the terms experiment and experience. In other words, experimentum resists or renders porous the attempt to definitively divide experiment and experience from one another. I'd like to take this undecidability and push it further, radicalize it. I propose not just an undecidability between, but a simultaneity of experiment and experience. To do this is to think experimentum both as an experimental experience and as an experiential experiment. With experimentum then, there's no division between experiment and experience. One does not experiment on experience, nor does one experience the experimental as something divided from supposedly normal, non-experimental experience. Experience is not the basis of experiment, and experiment is not the basis of experience. On the contrary, experience and experiment collapse into one another, such that neither has a distinct existence. Experience is an experiment, and experimentality breaks down the supposed basis of normal experience. One experiences experiment, one experiments experience, without any division, and especially without the division between sensible experience and mental experiment. In fact, I would say that experimentum, as the refusal of any division between sensible experience and mental experimentation, the refusal of this division, is aesthetics, or the aesthetics of baseless media. In keeping with such an aesthetics, I have one more excerpt which I'll talk about just for a little bit after I play. This is from, well, you have the information on your excerpt if you have it. If you don't, it's from the album Mad Villainy. It's 10-year anniversary of it. It's a really great album. While I don't have time to go into it, it's relevant, I think. I'll just flag this. The song is called Raid. Air raid, police raid, whatever. You have the lyrics there if you have them. Here. I just want to keep playing it. You probably do too. Shut up, Barber. Anyway, As with the Black Star, we find Doom, that was the Doom, or MF Doom was rapping in the excerpt you heard. As with the Black Star, we find Doom taking up the image of blackness in the sky. He remarks, quote, "One starry night I saw the light." Yet his seeing the light actually amounts to hearing a voice. Furthermore, the voice he hears is one quote that sound like Barry White, unquote, who is, if you don't know, a famous black singer. Thus, the white that Doom sees is not a star divided from blackness. On the contrary, it's a voice that remains black even as it's named white. And just as an aside further on in the stanza that you have, if those who hear Doom leave, quote, feel truly enlightened, unquote, when they leave, this is not because they saw the light of stars. On the contrary, it's because they went through the experimentum of hearing Doom, quote, spitting lightning. Right? So lightning is not something seen, it's something that comes out of the mouth. And there's so many other things going on. If we have time, we can talk about the fact, he says, there's a line in there about no headshot. Right? He wears a mask, which is, I would say, deeply Fanonian, as is the line that I'm going to discuss right now, which David Marriott has argued comes from a movie that was central to Fanon's writing Black Skin, White Masks. It's a movie called Victory. I don't have time to go into it, but one could argue that this line is about that. So, this line. Let's give attention finally, yes, finally, to the moment when Doom tells of a doctor who, quote, told a patient, unquote, a patient the doctor explicitly identifies in terms of blackness, that, quote, "It's all in your imagination." Now what's striking here is the juxtaposition between anti-blackness and contingent explanation. Not only does the doctor identify the patient as black, not only does the doctor presume the patient is sick, at base, the doctor identifies this sickness as something that's all in the patient's imagination. In other words, according to the doctor, the patient is sick not from actually suffering, but instead from imagining that it suffers. Right? The patient is sick from misrecognizing itself as sick and being stuck in its imagination. It can't escape its imagination. So the patient is sick, let's say, not from suffering the divisions of a world made by enlightenment. No, this is according to the doctor. No, the patient is sick from being incapable of dividing according to enlightenment. Enlightenment tells us what's in the head, merely in the imagination, what's real. So the patient, according to the doctor, is sick from being incapable of dividing according to enlightenment, incapable of dividing between what's actually real and what's merely in the imagination. The doctor thus mediates the patient as unenlightened about reality, and as sick precisely as a result of being unenlightened. In view of the doctor's own enlightenment, black suffering cannot appear. For the doctor, black suffering is mediated as the inability of blackness to divide, to stand out in accordance with enlightenment. So, Doom's response to this doctor, and I quote, "He need to cut the ego." On many levels. In other words, it's not the patient who's stuck in the imagination. It's the doctor who produces this imagination via enlightenment. In other words, when the doctor pathologizes blackness as unenlightened, as being sick all in your imagination, the doctor is actually simply imagining or mediating his own ego. He knows himself as doctor, as enlightened, as capable of pathologizing and diagnosing sickness, because he knows how to tell the difference between actual reality and what's merely in the imagination. So when the doctor pathologizes blackness as unenlightened, he's simply imagining and mediating his own ego. The doctor's ego is contingent upon his capacity to pathologize blackness, to divide himself from blackness, the patient, and thus to clarify his own ego, to make his ego stand out and come to light. In other words, the ego of the doctor is based on divisive mediation, on the division between enlightenment and blackness, the division between explanation and pathology. Against this divisive basis, there's nothing Nothing but baselessness, nothing but cutting the ego. Or as Doom says elsewhere on the album, there's no sky to see but the one with, quote, the chopped off heads of Leviathan. Thanks.